My story starts in July of 2003. Shortly before my 36th birthday, I smoked 5-methoxy-DMT for the very first time. Attaching no particular importance to the event and approaching it with the same characteristic lack of caution that has accompanied many of my various adventures in life, I sat down on a mattress in a nondescript suburban house in Portland, Oregon, and drew the strange-tasting smoke deep down into my lungs. I remember looking at my friend whose house we were in and wondering when something would happen before he reminded me to breathe out. When I did that, my old world, and indeed my old life, magically evaporated. So this was my first 5-MeO-DMT experience. With typical, when I first discovered 5-methoxy-DMT, there was very little information available out there about it. And I had actually been looking for DMT for years, thanks to Terence McKenna's work. Never had any luck in finding it. And then there was a period in the late 90s and early 2000s in the United States when a lot of substances, a lot of compounds were readily available via research chemical companies online. So I found out about this through a mutual friend and ordered a gram of 5-methoxy-DMT, which turned up at my house in a brown envelope. And then when I started to do the very little bit of reading about it, I realized that it wasn't DMT, and it was quite different, and so I was a little hesitant. So I agreed to go out to the West Coast to meet my friend who had given it to me, and we were supposed to go and smoke it at this event called the Oregon Country Fair, which is this famous hippie event in Oregon that Ken Kesey and the Grateful Dead, and it has this huge psychedelic history attached to it. But like many events, it's been around for more than 30 years, 40 years now, and it's kind of become quite rigid. So they have a night event and a day event, and all the general public comes in at day, but to get in at night, you have to have one of these coveted wristbands. And as it turned out, my friend didn't really have his shit together, and we never got these famous wristbands, so I was kind of denied entry into this psychedelic wonderland. And when we went back to Portland, I would have to say that I was at one of my psychedelic low points in terms of my interest in psychedelic culture. I was pretty pissed off that these hippies hadn't let me into the party. And so my buddy, he's just got a normal house in Portland, and there are no shrines or crystals or Buddhas or any of that kind of stuff. And he's like, oh, let's smoke some of that DMT stuff, eh? And I was like, yeah, let's give it a go. And I really expected it to be like the cross between a hit of acid and a bong hit, And so this is the actual experience you go through. I've had a go. The thing about the experience is it's not particularly linear, and it's very difficult for anyone to really say what they went through. And when I wrote my book, I didn't know if my experience was unique or it would resonate with other people. Over the last 9 years, it's resonated with a lot of people, and people seem to agree somewhat to me with the lineology. So the first thing is when you breathe out, you just sort of disappear in this tunnel of white fractally light, and there's this sense of rapid acceleration. You're just moving forward at the speed of light tremendously. And then at the peak, there's this kind of complete dissolution from ego and identity, any concept of time, as you dissolve into the one, what William James called cosmic consciousness. At this peak, what you can experience, and this is the bit that really I found the most amazing, is you experience consciousness without identity. So you're totally conscious of this hyper information kind of environment that you're occupying, but you have absolutely no memory or recollection of you or being a human being or Earth or any of that. And as soon as you start to try and remember these things, like to me there's this peak, the fear arising from disorientation, and you're like, oh my God, this is too much. Like, how did I get here? And who am I? And that's the killer. Once you get that one, you start getting, the ego starts reforming. And there's an abrupt repossession of your physical body as the last effects of the 5-MeO-DMT fade away, and this period of fading resonance between physical consciousness and God consciousness. Now, on this first case, one thing I'd say, if you're going to smoke synthetic 5-methoxy-DMT, get yourself a really good three decimal point scale, because you need an incredibly small amount of this compound, and the difference of just a tiny few milligrams can make a huge difference. On this occasion, we didn't have a decent scale, so I think we measured out smallest amount we could, and I cut it into 4 piles. And because I wanted to make sure it worked, of course I took the biggest pile, and it was probably in the range of 0.035 to 0.04 milligrams, which is double what I do these days. So I had quite the experience. I was, there's the separation between mind and body. So while my consciousness was away doing its thing, my body was doing completely different things back in this room. It tried to climb under the mattress that we had on the floor. And at one point I apparently got up and did a haka, a Maori war dance, and was, completely tearing this room. This event went on for like 30 or 40 minutes, which is a long trip. And my friends none of us had done it, none of us knew anything about it. So my poor friends didn't know if I was going to come out of this state. They were about ready to call 911 when I came to, standing in the corner of the room doing sun salutations with dragons and griffins and things flying around my head. This sense of unabated amazement continued to grow as I turned around and found my friend and his brother with their eyes wide open and their jaws agape after having been stunned witnesses to the whole affair. And when I learned that at one point I had gotten to my feet and ecstatically declared that it exists, and then later, I am there, I could only wonder what had actually just happened to me and what it was that I had just experienced. For in that half hour after I had exhaled from that pipe, I had come in contact with a force far greater than I'd ever known possible, or even imagined, and now felt as if I had blindly stuck my wet finger into the cosmic socket and come away with my senses totally fried. Suddenly, smoking 5-methoxy-DMT had become one of the most important events of my life. Now, why was it so important? The reason being, before I smoked 5-methoxy-DMT, I was pretty much a hardened and happy scientific rationalist, little interest in God, no need for it. I wasn't looking for anything. My life was good. Everything was on track. And then when I came out the other side of the experience, I suddenly believed I'd had a mystical union and actually not only recognized God, but become one with God. And that was really the only way I could describe the experience. I had to fall back on religious vocabulary that only an hour earlier would have repulsed me. So this was a huge surprise. I don't think he could have surprised me much more in a singular experience. And I'm not the kind of person who can just accept something like that. So I often say that 5-methoxy-DMT was the beginning of the greatest intellectual adventure of my life. And that adventure took the next 5 years as I started to build a worldview that I thought made sense. I didn't really expect to find any answers, and my book came out of the search as I was just really keeping track of the information as it was coming to me. But, I decided, all right, where am I going to start my investigation? I'll look at consciousness. What is consciousness and how does it work? And at that point, I hadn't really been reading up on consciousness much, and I figured, with all the brain mapping and all the things going on, we got consciousness pretty figured out, And then when I really started to get into some reading, I was pretty unimpressed with what we knew about consciousness and how it worked. What we do know is that visual information comes in from the eyes or sounds from the ears and things. They're broken into 3 or 4 streams of input, which then get re-put together as a holographic image in our brain, which we don't really understand. And, reality, as we see it, is not actually reality. We are ourselves seeing a projection of reality that's being rebuilt in our minds. So you're already starting to get this idea that consciousness is constructing our reality to a certain sense. And one of the things that I came away with from, I went through a period of smoking quite a lot of 5-MeO-DMT, and increasingly I couldn't accept this idea that consciousness was being produced within my brain. It really felt and seemed like I was accessing a field of consciousness, and that I was just getting more and more input, like this idea that consciousness is kind of a reducing valve, and that if you can open that valve, more and more information comes in. So increasingly I found myself looking to ideas that consciousness is some kind of a field or more primary. And of course, this is actually the big distinction between the West and the East. In the West, we follow, particularly since the Scientific Revolution, we follow the belief that everything's material and that we live in a material world, and that consciousness is a process that comes out of material actions. In the East, they believe something quite differently. They believe in something called monastic idealism. In this philosophy, consciousness, not matter, is fundamental. Both the world of matter and the world of mental phenomena, such as thought, are determined by consciousness. In addition to the material and mental spheres, which together form the immanent reality or world of manifestation, idealism posits a transcendental, archetypical realm of ideas as the source of material and mental phenomena. It is important to recognize that monastic idealism, as the name implies, is a unitary philosophy. Any subdivisions, such as the immanent and the transcendent, are within consciousness. Thus, consciousness is the only reality. Consciousness is the only reality. That's the kind of thing DMT smokers can really chew on. That's by Amit Goswami, who's an Indian-born physicist who's written some excellent books on the subject. So then I started to explore this idea that consciousness is actually a field. And I discovered that within our own science, we have some people thinking this way as well. The most influential was a man called David Bohm, who wrote a remarkable book called Wholeness and the Implement Order. Now, around this point, I went to India paragliding. I wasn't particularly looking for spiritual answers, but I ended up having a couple of accidents and spending a lot of time kind of grounded and doing a lot of reading. India has fantastic bookstores if you're in Delhi, amazing books. And I was sort of having a bunch of these ideas, and I was actually working on a novel at the time, and I was in Pushkar, India, which is a very interesting town because it's a town that represents all religions. And it's actually the only place in India where they have a temple to Brahma, the ultimate god, which I found out later. But in retrospect, it doesn't surprise me that I got the idea to write this book, Tryptamine Palace, while I was in Pushkar. And at the time, I was like, oh, that's a terrible idea. Nobody's publishing books on psychedelics. Nobody's even heard of the psychedelic. You're going to write, you're going to stop working on what you're working on and write this unpublishable project. But there was definitely something that kept pushing me that this was the direction that I needed to go. And from Pushkar, I went out to the Pakistani border, a place called Jaisalmer, and then I'd taken another train, and I was on this just incredibly slow Indian train, as they are, and we're going across the Rajasthani border, which was just completely flat and monotonous. And I was in this carriage. I had a first-class carriage by myself for like 9 hours or something, and I just started to have this stream of thoughts that consciousness and light were a linked entity. And they were so persistent, these thoughts. I was like, oh man, you're going to start writing this stuff down. So I grabbed a pen and paper and started to jot my ideas down. And a lot of these ideas became the framework for the book over the next few years. And one of the key ideas is that light and consciousness are somehow a linked entity. Now, in David Bohm's work, I found that he says matter is condensed or frozen light, although we can consider the world of matter to be light that's moving slower than the speed of light. So then I started to follow this a little further, and we start to get in these ideas that consciousness is not necessarily being generated by the brain, but the brain is some kind of a receiver that's receiving consciousness from a universal field. And one of these potential ways that this could be happening is that consciousness is actually a quantum process, and that the brain is accessing our information that's stored in this universal field, that we're all sharing the same kind of like cloud-type memory, I guess you would call it. And I found a very interesting book by a woman called Dana Zohar called The Quantum Self. And in this book, she comes up with a very interesting theory of how quantum consciousness could work. And it involves these things called Bose-Einstein condensates. Now I'm going to try and talk about some kind of scientific things in this talk. And I'll do my best to explain them as well as I can. A Bose-Einstein condensate is the ultimate state of coherence. It's something that they've discovered in superconductors. And what happens is when you lower helium to almost absolute zero and you create these Bose-Einstein condensates, if you have a bunch of things that are acting as individual particles or atoms or different things, if you can achieve the state of ultimate coherence, they not only begin to act like one, but they actually become one in a very real sense, in a physical sense. So the way I explain it is, if you imagine the neurons in your brain, there's as many neurons in your brain as there are stars in the Milky Way, right? So all the neurons are like little particles. They have a positive and a negative, a dipole. And the other way you could look at them is like being little compasses. Now, what Dana Zohar was looking was for this coherence in consciousness. Because what we have with human consciousness is a unified whole. We don't have these different streams that come up to us. You know, we take all these different streams and we create this 3D, all around us, completely immersive experience that we think's reality, but is actually the consciousness in our brain interpreting reality. So she was like, how do all these different fields of information get presented to us so seamlessly integrated? So this is where she came up with this idea of the Bose-Einstein condensate. Now imagine if all the neurons in your brain are little compasses, and they're all spinning around. Now at normal consciousness, let's say 70% of the neurons in your brain are all in the same direction. So let's say they're all pointing north-south. But there's still a chunk of your brain that's not as coherent, and the other neurons are doing their own thing and spinning around. Now, if you can achieve this Bose-Einstein condensate and all the neurons can snap into the same function, then you actually achieve this unitary state. So her theory was that this consciousness is being produced by this Bose-Einstein condensate. I was like, well, that's a very interesting concept. So I was definitely thinking about that. But I was still thinking about light. You know, and then when I was in India, I found this quote from the Bhagavad Gita, I think it was Krishna saying to Hanuman, and he says, "Nothing is faster than mind." And it's like, well, what if that's true? What if consciousness is actually working faster than the speed of light, at almost like a non-local effect? And if that's the question, then where does the light that I experienced during a 5-MeO-DMT experience come from? Because that was another big question. How can you explain in a completely dark room, if you smoke 5-methoxy-DMT, you encounter the brightest light you'll ever experience in your life? Now, our model of consciousness says we need an input to create this internal picture. So we need light to make the picture, right? And that's one of the reasons we don't really understand dreaming at all. So my theory was, well, this light's real. It's coming from somewhere. Where's it coming from? Now, this is from Peter Russell. Since light travels at the speed of light, let's imagine a disembodied observer, pure mind with no mass, traveling at the speed of light. Einstein's equations would predict that from light's own point of view, it travels no distance and takes 0 time to do so. This points out something very strange indeed about light. Whatever light is, it seems to exist in a realm where there is no before and no after. There's only now. Now that's very much what you feel you're encountering in a 5-methoxy-DMT experience. A light realm where there's no before, there's no after, there's only now. So in my mind, my consciousness, once it was freed of the mass of my body, could achieve this non-local light state. And that's, when you have a 5-MeO-DMT experience of all the psychedelics, that's the one that will truly give you the real separation between body and mind. Now, in Jeremy Narby's excellent book, The Cosmic Serpent, he was kind of on a similar track. And, Narby, has anybody, I presume a bunch of you have read Narby's books. Narby is a very interesting French-Canadian anthropologist who spent a bunch of years, I think he was in the Amazon for 6 months or something, and he was with this tribe, and he kept asking the shaman every day, he's like, how do you guys know about the plants? And he's like, the plants tell us. How do you know about the plants? The plants tell us. He's like, yeah, but really, how do you know about the plants, So finally, on his last night there, the shaman says to him, look, the only way you're going to understand is if you try ayahuasca. Now, Narby was an even more of a scientific rationalist in his box than me, especially being half Swiss. So the ayahuasca completely knocks him out of his box. And at one point, he thinks he's stepping over these giant anacondas, these light snakes. He's like trying to navigate his way outside the hut to puke. And he comes to the theory that these snakes, and he traces, a bit like Octavio just did with the toad, he traces these snakes through all cultures all around the world. And his theory is that these snakes are actually our DNA that's talking to us. And he discovered that our DNA actually emits light. Because Narby went down the same route that I did. He was like, well, maybe the light's contained internally within the compound itself. Now, there's another interesting sort of side note. LSD and DMT are both psychomimetic, I think that's the right word, which means they actually emit light. Nick Sand told me you can take a gram of LSD and put it in a solution in a jar and shake it in a dark room and it'll glow like a light bulb. And DMT, he told me the story that they had made this tray of DMT that overrun everywhere, and it kind of got on this tray. So he sent his assistant down into the basement to break this stuff up so they could recompound it. And he said there was these flashes. The guy hit it with a hammer, and there's this big explosion of light. DMT and LSD, very strangely, both actually can emit light. But it turns out that our DNA emits light, and it's by way of these things called biophotonic emissions. Now, what are biophotonic emissions? This is proposed by Professor Herbert Frolick, and he proposes that these Bose-Einstein condensates that we just learned about that supposedly can only exist at absolute zero in superconductors can actually live in living tissue. And that if you pump enough energy into a system, these virtual particles end up getting pumped out through this form of, once again, superior coherence. So now where Jeremy sort of ends his inquiry, he discovers the DNA is emitting the light, and that's enough for him. I was like, well, hang on, where's the light actually coming from? What is the source of these biophotonic emissions or virtual particles? And that was when I discovered something called the quantum vacuum, also known as the 0 point or akashic field. Now this is the underlying holographic energy field in the universe. Now this is not fairy science. This is actually scientifically verified. Alan Aspect's experiments where they're teleporting electrons is verification of this 0-point field, and we now believe that let's start with the name, the 0 point. If you took, say, a meter of space and you made it a complete vacuum and pulled all the matter out of it, it's supposed to be devoid of energy. But what we've actually discovered is it's the opposite, and that this void, this vacuum, this emptiness that we've always been told about is actually energetically the most energetic thing in the universe. Richard Feynman calculated there's enough energy in a meter of square vacuum to boil all the waters in the ocean. And all the talk you hear about free energy and energy that's going to come, this is all 0-point technologies. A lot of nanotechnologies based on 0 point. Something called Casimir forces, where if you have two plates that are perfectly polished and are put together, the quantum vacuum actually pushes them together. So all the nanotechnology, a lot of stuff's being done on the micro scale, is based on this quantum vacuum. And what we now discovered is that what we thought was emptiness in the universe is actually this fullness, right? So this resulted in an entire different way of me viewing the universe. This 0-point field is supposedly the densest thing known in the universe, and it has a crystalline structure. The quantum vacuum is a kind of neo-ether through which all matter and energy evolves in continuous non-Hertzian communication. The neo-ether model posits that the vacuum state has the same properties as a dynamic holography crystal. It infinitely stores the diffraction patterns of matter-energy systems in a non-temporal and non-local fashion, analogous to holographic information storage. Now, I don't know what you guys know about holography, but the way a hologram works is you can take any part of the hologram and you'll recreate the rest of it. So the idea is that this field is an infinite information carrying field, and that all the waves and patterns and energies that have ever been created get stored, or the pattern of their existence is stored within this holographic crystal, and then it learns, it takes this information and continues it on. So the way I look at it is, before we thought the universe was empty, right? All the space between matter, between molecules and atoms, or between planets and moons and stars, as kids we're told it's this emptiness, right? Well, actually the correct way to visualize this is you imagine that universe is a gigantic block of ice, but it's like Swiss cheese, and everywhere where there are the holes is actually the universe of matter, because matter is a more chaotic version of the field. Matter isn't a denser object, it's actually a less dense. So matter's like, Einstein described it as like whirlpools of discord within the perfection of the field. So this is the idea. Quantum consciousness is based on the idea that this field could actually be the carrying field that our thoughts, our emotions, and the world of consciousness actually exists in this field. And the field is actually light, like it is a field of light. It's just at a frequency that we can't see because it's too small, and because it surrounds us and is within us at all angles, we're unaware of it, but we're actually existing in this ocean of light. Now, the most complex theory based on this is this idea by Roger Penrose and Stuart Hamerhoff. Roger Penrose is a physicist from England. Hamerhoff is an anaesthetologist, which is a very interesting profession, and he actually runs the consciousness convention in Arizona one year and somewhere else in the world. And they've come up with this model that uses microtubules. Now, I hadn't really known much about microtubules when I wrote Tryptamine Palace, so there's not much in them. But microtubules are really fascinating. They're these tiny little protein tubes that are the most complicated known system in the universe. There's as many neurons in your brain as there are stars in the Milky Way. There are as many microtubules in your body as there are stars in the entire universe. And they're like this tiny scaffolding that run through all the neurons and all the cells, and they're hollow inside. So the Penrose model has that's like the internet of the body, and that the hollowness is actually filled with this electrostatic light, the 0-point field. And this explains things like non-locality in the body. Because one of the big mysteries of our chemistry is how do all these different tens of thousands of chemical processes in the body and all the things that are going on, are perfectly timed, and it's actually been proven that information's traveling around the body faster than the speed of light. So there's a lot of processes going on which we call non-local. Now, non-locality in quantum physics is when something happens in one place and it influences something, could be on the other side of the universe, and there's absolutely no time difference because it's not operating in a conventional sense where it's moving from one position to another position. It's just in one position and then it reappears on the other position. And if two particles become entangled, if they cross each other, they then influence each other no matter how great the distance. So the way I see the microtubule model, now one of the interesting things about the microtubules is it's supposedly right in the center of the galactic scale, or very close to it. So you have the largest known structures in the universe, quasars and giant structures, and then the smallest known physical thing is known as the Planck length. Beyond the Planck length, we enter the quantum. So the human beings in our microtubule system are right smack in the middle of the galactic scale. Now, if you were going to create a computer that's job was to experience the universe and be able to report on the shape of the universe from one size to the other, you would want that instrument to be right in the middle, which is where we occupy, which I think is kind of funny that after thousands of years ago, we believed that the Earth was the center of the universe, and then we moved away to a different model. But increasingly, I feel we come back to the idea that human beings and our consciousness are actually at the center of the universe. And I'm one of the people that believes that consciousness is creating form, and that as we look out into the universe and as we build instruments that are discovering these things, we're actually creating them. Consciousness is driving the creation aspect of the universe. So my idea with microtubules, because they exist right at the edge of the quantum, I see them as almost like a net, like this fishing net that's just lying in the quantum sea, and it's being buffeted by quantum information. So it actually buffets this microtubule structure enough that it takes the quantum information and converts it to chemical information, which is how consciousness works and how the information travels around the body. Now this is Ervin Laszlo, who one of the reasons they call the 0-point field the Akashic field is that Ervin Laszlo, who invented systems theory, has written a couple of amazing books. He went out looking for something, he spent his whole life looking for this connectivity hypothesis, this thing that links everything together and can actually bring all the philosophies and all the questions and all the answers and pull it together. And to him, this field is this thing that links everything, the transpersonal, that can explain so many things. He says, the evidence that surfaces, surprising it may be, indicates that our brain is not limited to the neural processes that go on with our cranium. It is a wideband receiver and high-powered processor of information. The information it receives originates not only in our own body, but comes from all over the world. The brain's 10 billion neurons with 10,000 connections each constitute the most complex system of electronic organization in the known universe. This system, which operates at the edge of chaos, receives and transforms information from our own body, as well as the electromagnetic, acoustic, and other wave fields in our environment. It also receives and decodes information from more subtle fields, including the vacuum's 0-point hollow field. Potentially, our brain connects us with the wide reaches of the cosmos. As mystics, prophets, and people of insight and sensitivity intuited throughout the ages, our brain is an integral part of the universe, and our mind is a potentially open window on it. It is up to us to throw open that window to the full extent of our remarkable but hitherto largely unexploited physical and mental capacities. if anybody's interested in this stuff, I really recommend Laszlo's Science in the Akashic Field. One of the best reasons to buy my book is there's an awesome bibliography in it. So this is where we come to my singularly, I think, contribution to the field of psychedelic thought. I believe that the 5-MeO-DMT experience, the transpersonal experience, or the entheo-mystical experience, is a classical mystical experience. There's absolutely no difference between the mystical experience that's been talked about throughout history and this one, and that this involves this experience where you really experience the connectative and the unification of all things, because you're experiencing consciousness as part of this universal field. So to me, this is very much explained by this idea of the Bose-Einstein condensate, and that what the transpersonal experience is very much a neurological Bose-Einstein condensate, which means that all the separation is removed from all the different streams of information, so it comes as a singular whole. Now, I once did a workshop with Stuart Hammerhoff, who has the ORC theory, and I asked him afterwards, I was like, so you guys once had this theory that consciousness was some kind of a Bose-Einstein condensate? And he said, yeah, and we abandoned that. He said, because if consciousness was a Bose-Einstein condensate, you wouldn't be able to differentiate anything, and all the information would just come as a big singular whole. And I was like, that's exactly what I believe. So I really think that's what's happening when you smoke 5-MeO-DMT, is that the coherence within our brain is increased. So this, basically all the neurons or the microtubules or whatever the system that's working, it snaps into this ultimate coherence, and we don't have the dividing valve that separates all the different streams of information. Now, whether that is a chemical process within the brain or is actually access to this 0-point energy field that I think is the storing field for information, we don't know. But I do think it helps explain why it feels like you've come in contact with God, or Source, as I prefer to call it these days, because it's less controversial. Because according to Laszlo, every human existence influences this 0-point field. Everything that's existed throughout time creates a wave, and this wave gets recorded in the field forever, for infinity. And when these waves cross and entangle, they grow. So the mind of God, if you like, is all of our experiences that we are constantly inputting into this field, that it then becomes more of a singular entity. So when you experience it, that's what you experience. That's why I think you can explain, for example, past lives under this model, because you're not necessarily experiencing you weren't necessarily that person in another life, but you are able to experience that life because all that information remains retained within this field. And in Laszlo's model, the universe informs itself and then collapses, and the next universe in the multiverse is created with this information still stored. So this is what increases complexity in the universe. And I think that is a good explanation of how you can scientifically feel like you've actually experienced unity with the Godhead. And it's this experience of consciousness with our identity, which we can also call ego death, that makes you really realize that there are other fields of consciousness in play, and that the ego, which has previously only been, to me, a philosophical concept, is actually a very real thing. Because of that, I became very interested in Eckhart Tolle's work, and I actually read his very excellent book, A New Earth, right after I finished Tryptamine Palace. It was the first book I read next. I'd been carrying it around for like a year, and I was so glad that I read it after I had handed my manuscript in, because I might have spent another 10 years trying to integrate that into my ideas. But Tolle's point is that this, in our society, the ego has become all dominant, and we've lost contact with this other greater field of consciousness, and we're convinced that we are running the ship, but really that's just part of a much bigger picture. My other talk yesterday, I'll just briefly go over it. I have a scale that I came up with. I said if you take all the known compounds and you rank them via their effect on the ego, so at the top you have 5-methoxy-DMT, and then you have DMT, and you come down, and then at the bottom you have ego-reinforcing compounds like cocaine and alcohol, you find there's a direct relationship to toxicity. So the compounds that most disrupt our ego are the ones that are the least toxic and the least addictive. And the more a compound reinforces the ego, much like the ego itself, it becomes more toxic and more addictive. So I think if you are involved in a program of steady psychedelic use, that it's very useful to consider that your own ego and the role of the ego. Tola always talks about the idea that the ego is constantly trying to tell you it's reformed itself and that you don't need to keep doing the self-work. But I am with Ken Kesey when he says that he doesn't know anybody that's ever got it. You know, what we really are trying to create is a garden where mystery blooms, and we have these tools and processes to keep working on our own self constantly. It never really stops. So I kind of tongue-in-cheek call this the Oroc law of entheogens. It says the more a compound disrupts the ego, the less toxic it will be. The more a compound reinforces the ego, the more toxic it will be. And finally, I'd like us just to consider the fact that DMT and 5-methoxy-DMT are endogenous. And I had some great talks with Nick Sand, who I've mentioned earlier. He was the inventor of Orange Sunshine LSD. He's also the guy that figured out you could smoke DMT, and he was a real wizard. And when I first met Nick, I was at the MAPS conference in San Jose, and you know I'm a bit of a historian, so I'm constantly poking around on the internet finding weird stuff. And I had found his arrest report when he got arrested in Canada. And he got arrested with this huge lab, and he had all this acid, and he had 4 kilos of DMT. And they asked him about 5-methoxy-DMT, and he said, "Oh, I don't like it." So when I met him, I was like, "Oh, it's a bit embarrassing, Mr. Sand, but I read your police report, and I'm kind of curious about your stand on 5-MeO-DMT." So we got into this great conversation, and it turned out he had changed his opinion. Now, this is one of the things you've got to remember about 5-MeO-DMT is it has a dark side too. It can be physically very hard on people, and if you have a hard time letting go of your ego, it can drag you through hell. Now, I'm very wary of small doses. It's kind of, you know, most people warn you about the larger doses. I'm a little worried about like the under 10 milligram doses, because I think they have a tendency to cause people to have seizures more. Nick, the first time he ever tried it, had a seizure on 6 milligrams. Now, I think there's definitely a fine line. One of the problems with smoking 5-MeO-DMT is you can have this whiteout experience where people come back from the experience and they don't really remember very much. So the trick is to kind of find the right amount where you're dialing it back down to retain the maximum amount of the experience, kind of this minimum effective dose, which I think is around 0.015, 0.018 of a gram myself if you've got synthetic and you're experimenting in those realms. But I do recommend that you bump it down. But anyway, so the conversation I had with Nick, he is a huge fan of DMT, and he described DMT as the fullness, and which I relate to Joseph Conrad's description of the 6th chakra. And at the 6th chakra, this is the realm of mythology. This is where you see all the gods and goddesses, all the beautiful visions, anything that can be visioned, imagined, the gardens of paradise. It's all at the 6th chakra. But there's still this division between you and God, between you and the beloved. There's the object and there's the observer. Now, when you go to the 7th chakra, this all disappears and it all becomes one. Ramakrishna used to be able to describe the ascent of the Kundalini, but when he went from the 6th to the 7th, he would pass out because the 7th chakra is untranslatable. The experience is beyond words, beyond description, much like 5-MeO-DMT. So Nick would describe DMT as the fullness, and he would describe 5-MeO as the void. And I think that's a very good description because DMT has the mythological component, 5-MeO-DMT has the mystical component, the void that's a plenum. You know, this this area, this void that's full of energy and information. Now, when you consider both of these chemicals are endogenous and produced within our bodies, though there's debate about how much and how effectively, I would think it would be very interesting to the scholars of the world that the two most powerful psychedelics, one that produces a mythological effect, one that produces a mystical experience, naturally being produced within our bodies. This is the tension that's created all religion, a mystical spark, and the mythology that builds around it. So I hope in the days when psychedelic studies become more legal, this is an avenue we'll really look into, is what effect these endogenous chemicals have had on the construction of our own religious societies. And finally, the first step to mystical realization is the leaving of a defined God for the experience of transcendence, disengaging the ethnic from the elementary idea. For any God that is not transparent to transcendence is an idol, and its worship is adultery. Also, the first step to participation in the destiny of humanity today, which is neither of this folk or of that, but of the whole population of the globe, is to recognize every such local image of a God as but one of many thousands, millions, perhaps even billions of locally useful symbolizations of that same mystery, beyond sight or thought, which our teachers have taught us to seek in their God alone. Black Elk's phrase, "the center is everywhere," is matched by a statement from a Hermetic early medieval text: God is an infinite sphere whose center is everywhere and circumference is nowhere. And I think if there's any chance we have for peace on this planet, that's the lesson we have to learn, the importance of the central sameness of the mystical experience for all cultures. So finally, I'd say the most practical use of entheogens are for examining and experiencing these differentiated states of consciousness, for examining the action and purpose of consciousness itself, for realizing the existence of ego and experiencing the field of universal consciousness without it, for experiencing the transpersonal nature of reality that is the common ground of all mystical experiences, and for realizing our common connection with Source. Thank you very much. My name's James Oroc. I have an information site, www.dmtsite.com, and this is my new book, The New Psychedelic Revolution. I've been super impressed with this conference. You've been an awesome audience. I think the questions have been off the hook, and I've just been having a really great time. So thank you very much, Australia.